Thank you for inviting me to address this Congress. I've long been an admirer of PEN International. It's remarkably difficult to write about hunger, but it's important not to be silent. There are very few memoirs of famine. Starvation has its own language and its own silences. One of the very first reports I wrote on famine was in 1990 for Article 19. It was entitled Starving in Silence, a report on famine and censorship. It was inspired by Amartya Sen's observation that a free press is critically important for famine prevention. In fact, there is no better mechanism. That focused on media as a form of early warning of food crisis and on accountability after the fact. These are both vitally important. In this presentation, I want to take a different angle. I want to focus on the silences and erasures around starvation and how the difficulty of writing about the human experience of starvation can play into the hands of those who want to conceal famine. In the siege of Leningrad during World War II, when more than a third of the city's population starved to death, the authorities forbade mention of starvation. People were permitted to speak only of dystrophy. The writer Lydia Ginsburg, in her fictionalized memoir, Notes from the Blockade, wrote, "The well-fed do not understand the hungry, themselves included. Once having eaten his fill, a man gradually lost his understanding of himself, the way he had been in the months of the Great Hunger. The blockade people forgot their sensations, but they remembered facts. Facts slowly crept out of the dimness of memory into the light of behavioral rules which were gravitating by now back towards the accepted norm." What Ginsburg is referring to here is the way that the rules of life change under starvation, how hunger made a norm of abnormality, how it forced people to break the deepest social taboos in trying to stay alive. Beware, she wrote, hungry as beasts. And indeed, in every account of starvation on record, that we see eating like a beast. In the German, essen is to eat as a person, fressen is to eat as a wild animal. This is the word used by Primo Levi for how the inmates in Auschwitz would devour what little food they could get. Human beings compelled to scrabble in the dirt for food, to eat animal fodder, to hide food, to steal food, to deny food from neighbors, friends, family members. In the starvation camps of Auschwitz or the Khmer Rouge, people killing for a spoon. These are bare facts that are hard to clothe in words. Ginsburg again. The mists of dystrophy disperse, and the one alienated from himself comes face to face with the objects of his shame and remorse. For those who survived the siege, remorse was as inevitable as malnutrition changes the body. In its grimmest form, too, uncomprehending remorse. A person recalls the fact but cannot summon up the experience of that piece of bread, that sweet, which had prompted him to cruel, dishonorable, humiliating deeds. This indeed is the experience of famine, dehumanization, shame, the petty quotidian cruelties. But the dehumanizer is not in the story. The crime of starvation is committed remotely. Famine denialism is a phenomenon that has yet to be studied properly. I made a start last year with a lecture to commemorate the Holodomor in Ukraine. The men who make man-made famines conceal their crime, and if they cannot hide the fact of the crime, they deny their responsibility. This was true of the colonial powers, of Stalin, of Mao Zedong, and in more recent years, the rulers of Ethiopia and Sudan. When they acknowledged famine, they called it an act of God, or they said it was unavoidable, even justifiable. The 1943 famine in Bengal, India, has a special place in the annals of famine denialism. It was wartime, and the British authorities strictly censored any mention of the words starvation or famine. But the editor of the Statesman newspaper in Calcutta, Ian Stevens, broke the censor's ban with a simple expedient. He published photographs without any captions. It had an impact. British opinion was galvanized. Policy changed. But Winston Churchill was reluctant. He said that Indians were less deserving than other starving people. For example, the sturdy Greeks, also facing hunger because of the war. Now, Churchill was a Victorian, and like many of his generation, when he saw pictures of starving Indians, he was moved not to pity and compassion, but to revulsion. The degradation he saw, he blamed on the victims themselves, on their fecklessness, he supposed, or for having too many children. Seeing people reduced to animal-like condition, we want to distance ourselves. Dehumanization can become self-justifying. There can be a subtle collusion between those who portray starvation and those who perpetrate it. Over the decades after World War II, there was a tension between those who took photographs or commissioned them and those who wanted to extend dignity to the victim. The researcher David Campbell criticized the media and some of the aid agencies for their pictures. I myself called it disaster pornography in the case of Somalia, as in this photograph. Here are two pictures from Sudan. The first shows a little girl and a vulture. The message is clear. The second shows a starving boy and a man carrying food. Those who perpetrate starvation are never, almost never, I should say, in the frame. And this picture insinuates that the man carrying the food is cruel or indifferent, perhaps a merchant who's profiting from the high price of food. We don't know. It's a simple reality that in all famines, it's the poorest who starve, and there are less poor people who are less hungry or not hungry at all. But that's an insinuation common to many famine images. The true culprits aren't in the frame. We see the outcome of starvation, not the act. Here are two photographs taken by a German soldier who visited the Warsaw Ghetto in 1941, and the captions he gave to those pictures. Heinrich Jost was an amateur photographer. His pictures were unstaged and they were private. He only made them public 40 years later. What they show is not Nazi propaganda, but the worldview of a German soldier in the Wehrmacht, informed by Nazi propaganda. So here's the first, and here's his caption. Where would this rickshaw driver take this child who was obviously sick with typhus? Was there still a hospital for Jews? No one among my German comrades could tell me. You can almost hear the mockery in his voice. And the next slide. He wrote, next to a lady with a good coat and shoes that had heels, stood this broken down man barefoot with his barefoot child on his shoulders. This echoes Nazi propaganda pictures that showed starving Jews next to well-fed Jews, blaming the suffering of the poor Jews on the avarice and the cruelty of the rich Jews. This dehumanization can even become internalized by the survivors themselves. In the aftermath of the Great Famine in Ireland in the 1840s came the Great Silence. So deep was the trauma that generations of Irish people simply didn't want to talk about it. Like Ginsberg, they could remember the bare facts, though they didn't want to, but they couldn't make sense of those facts. The Irish writer Fintan O'Toole said, "Rage and grief fall between the cracks of a language which, stretched beyond breaking point, is unable to contain them." In public language, certainly. In private, perhaps less so. We need to listen carefully. So, for example, in his history of those post-famine years, Brendan McSwain provides neither any description of the starvation itself, nor even any oral histories of those years. Rather, starvation is tacitly acknowledged. It's a ubiquitous presence, a totem and taboo imprinted on every element of life. And it was only in the 1990s that the Irish began to publicly commemorate that famine, representing what had been hidden, becoming sensitive to those erased narratives and scripts. This is the Famine Memorial in Toronto, in Canada. It has a figurative representation of the loss of home. There's also a representation of the cliffs of the west of Ireland, and hidden in the crevices in of the cliffs, the names of the people who perished. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, it's the Irish aid agencies that pioneered a code of conduct for how contemporary famines should be represented. The focus is on a combination of being truthful and representing the dignity of the starving. And they adopted 7 guiding principles. Here they are. I think it is possible to represent the victims of starvation with dignity. Here are 2 pictures of the victims of British concentration camps in South Africa in 1901, taken by the activist Emily Hobhouse. There, I think we see humanity. In the current world, there are cases of mass starvation that demand our attention. Sudan, South Sudan, Yemen, the Rohingya, once again Ethiopia, but above all, Gaza. Now, starvation in Gaza today is unique because the capacity to end it exists. This is a capacity, this is a catastrophe that could be ended within a day or 2 if Israel were to choose to do so. It's not choosing to do so. Every kind of denial is there, keeping out journalists, suppressing humanitarian data, and then accusing the UN of fabricating data. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu rejects the UN finding of famine. He claims that the UN changed its definition of famine to defame Israel, which simply isn't true. He didn't mention that on that very same day, the US's own famine early warning system, FuseNet, came out with an independent report that said exactly the same thing. There's famine in Gaza. But it wasn't these reports that made the difference to public opinion. It was pictures that made the difference. Even President Donald Trump said that these children looked hungry and they couldn't be faked. This picture was taken by the Palestinian photojournalist Miriam Abu Dhaka. Netanyahu said these pictures were fake, that the children had pre-existing conditions, as though starving children who were already sick were an exculpation, not an aggravating factor. He said that because there were also people in the pictures who weren't starving, it couldn't be a famine, and that those who were dying of hunger were doing so because of other Palestinians withholding food. We've heard this before. Netanyahu is joining an extremely disreputable list. Israel is waging a war that will, it hopes, only ever be narrated in the words it chooses. It's destroying archives. It's blowing up universities. It's killing journalists at a more terrible rate than in any other war. And last week, it murdered Miriam Abu Dhaka, whose picture of a starving child I showed a few moments ago. The World Peace Foundation recently collaborated with the group Forensic Architecture to produce a report on what we called the architecture of genocidal starvation. In choosing that form of words, the point was not to indicate that Israel intends to kill every Palestinian in Gaza by starvation, but rather that it intends to break Palestinian society, and that starvation is a weapon in pursuit of that goal, to break the spirit of the society. And key is the weapon of dehumanizing people, degrading and humiliating them through hunger, turning them against each other, making them into the animals that their tormentors claim that already are, scrabbling in the dirt for food and throwing the dusts and grains in the air in frustration because dirt and food can't be separated, rushing forward towards the ration stations of the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation in the far south of the Gaza Strip, where they must brave the bullets of Israeli soldiers and American mercenaries. This picture is the rarest image of a famine, as it includes a perpetrator of the crime of starvation. Not, unfortunately, a high-level perpetrator, just a single contractor with his gun. They are herded into cages at the GHF ration station, where people are fed as if they were animals in a zoo. And in the places where the UN can still bring in food, the trucks are mobbed. People fight over what food is allowed in. As much as the biological trauma of starvation, it's this social trauma that will live on in Palestinian society for a generation. Ginsburg wrote that in trying to recall, to relive the experience of starvation, an experience that can never be erased but can never fully be expressed, it's the written word that breaks the circle. In writing the words to starve, we must always be conscious that we need to ask not just who is being starved, but who is doing the starving. And similarly, we need to represent the brute degradation of starvation in images, aware of who is absent from those images, how to represent the perpetrator, how to narrate starvation as an act. These are the challenges for journalists, for photographers, for writers, for artists. Let me end this rather dark presentation by quoting Bertolt Brecht. And in the dark times, will there also be singing? Yes, there will also be singing about the dark time. It's been a privilege to be able to address you. Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best for this important Congress.